Good morning. We're here with Steve Marcus in the Halford Jewish Community Services building on Wednesday, October 20th, as part of the Milwaukee Jewish Historical Society's archival project, which is linked to 350 years of Jewish settlement in the United States. Good morning. For the record, perhaps if you can give us your name and when and where you were born.
Good morning. My name is Steve Marcus, and I was born on May 31st, 1935 in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
In Minneapolis, a Midwesterner. Could you give us a little background about your parents and grandparents and where they came from and when they landed in the States and what brought them then to Milwaukee?
Well, my mother was born and raised in Minneapolis. My father was born in Poland, Russia. The border kept moving at that time in 1911, and in 1925, he and his mother and his sisters came to this country. They came across the Atlantic Ocean on the Berengaria was the name of the ship that they were on, and he was then, of course, 14 years old. His father had preceded the family by about 6 or 7 years, I believe it was, and he had come to this country and made his way to the Minneapolis area and got established raising cattle, and actually he was a cattle broker, I think, more than raising the cattle, and started to make some money, which he then sent back to the family so that the family could come to the United States.
When you were born in Minneapolis, as you said, when did you move to Wisconsin?
Well, let's see, I was 6 months old when we moved to Wisconsin. My father had decided to go into the movie theater business, found an opportunity in Ripon, Wisconsin, and so when I was 6 months old, he moved my mother and myself to Ripon so that they could open their first movie theater.
What do you remember about growing up in Ripon, and how long did you live there before you and the family moved to Milwaukee?
We lived in Ripon for 9 years, so it would have been 1944 that we moved then to Oshkosh, Wisconsin. That was our next move. I think growing up during that time, interestingly enough, was pretty uneventful, although Ripon only had 3 Jewish families, but my father owned the movie theater in town, and that was because the war was going on at the time. Going to the movies was a very popular thing to do. It was a way of forgetting. You have to remember those were the days before TV, and so if you wanted to see something about the war, other than listening to reports on the radio, if you wanted to actually see pictures of it, you went to the movies because they had newsreels every week. And people in those days would go to the movies every week. But it was a way of forgetting their concerns about the Depression, which was raging at the time, and what was happening with the war. It was a great way to escape and be transported sort of into another world. And so many people were going to movies, and so that was. So I think in that respect, he was revered in the community, and our family was revered in the community for having brought the movies to Ripon, because they had no theater before we came there.
Oh, so when you moved to Ripon, he established a theater there?
He established the theater, yes.
Well, why Ripon?
Because it was he and a cousin of my mother's had decided that they were going to go into the movie theater business, and his cousin lived in Marshfield, in Neillsville, Wisconsin, and between the two of them, they'd searched for a town that didn't have a movie theater, and Ripon was it.
How, speaking of your mother and their family and then your father, where and when and how did your parents meet?
My parents met in Minneapolis. The two families lived only a few blocks from one another, and they met in school. They met they actually met, I believe, through their Sunday school, through their temple.
From Ripon, you mentioned a moment ago that you moved to Oshkosh. How long did you live in Oshkosh?
We lived in Oshkosh for 9 years, all through my high school years. And when I graduated high school, that was when family moved to Milwaukee.
Okay. So both of those communities have small, you mentioned Ripon and Oshkosh as well, relatively small Jewish communities.
Yes.
What was it like in Oshkosh, and then overall, what was your sense of growing up Jewish?
Well, Oshkosh had 40 Jewish families. I think that's why my parents decided they wanted to move there, because they wanted us to have more of a Jewish environment to grow up in. And in fact, through the years that we lived in Ripon, when they went to Temple, they would go to Oshkosh to go to Temple. And I'll never forget that Temple. That was a little old building with a pot-bellied stove, and that's a pot-bellied heating system right in the sanctuary. Of course, the whole building was sanctuary, and so it was pretty primitive now that I look back on it. But it was. I think I did have a much better sense of growing up Jewish, and of course, that was when I started to go to Sunday school and prepare for my bar mitzvah, and then following that, my confirmation.
So even though even though a community of 40 families, so you became a bar mitzvah and went through confirmation.
Yes, and interestingly enough, during that time period, as I indicated, they had a pretty primitive synagogue, if you will. During those years, my father became the chairman of the building campaign for a new temple there, and they, in fact, built and opened the new temple while we were there. And I think because of that, he and the whole family became very involved in the Jewish life of that community, such as it was. And so I had a very strong sense of growing up Jewish. And I'll never forget my being in the movie theater business and living in Oshkosh. We would, my father would screen movies 2 nights a week at our house. And we'd see double features each night. There were that many movies being made. And each time our friends would come and join them, the friends actually of my parents would come and join them to watch these movies, because my father wanted to get an idea of what they thought about the various pictures, whether they liked them, didn't like them. And and during that time, we were building the temple. Well, my sister and I, my sister Diane, who's 3 years younger than I am, decided that would be a perfect opportunity to raise money for the building fund of the temple. And so when the screenings would go on, we would open a concession stand at the in our screening room in our home, and between the movies we would sell basically soda and candy bars, and that became our contribution to the temple fund. And of course, my father and mother spent the money to buy the soft drinks and the candy, and somehow we had a very good cost of product because I'm not sure that we ever did pay them for it.
Right, your net proceeds were pretty strong.
Yes.
So you got a very early start on community and philanthropic life.
Yes, very early. And as I said, I had a very strong sense of being Jewish during that time period.
In that regard, in what ways in Ripon and in Oshkosh, before the family moved to Milwaukee at a time when you then were moving away to go to college, what did you sense your family as a traditionally Jewish family in terms of observance and participation, or was it more catch as catch can? What's your sense of that?
My sense of that was that we went to temple a lot on Friday nights. I know that. I'm not sure that we ever lit candles or had. We didn't. The temple was a Reformed temple, and at least that's my recollection of it. And during most of that time, we didn't have a full-time rabbi. It was a traveling rabbi. So I don't think I had the intensity of what some families in this area in this day and age might have, but I had a pretty good sense of it. Maybe more than I subsequently gave to my own kids, but I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about the
The
comparison.
comparison, right, sure, different generations and
Exactly.
different support systems too in place.
Yes.
But speaking of the generations and and the locations in which you grew up, in your youth and formative years, were you aware of or personally exposed in any way to anti-Semitism?
I didn't notice any in Ripon, but I did notice some in Oshkosh, which was pretty disturbing to me as it happened, but relatively uneventful for me. My parents may have experienced more, but they never indicated any of that to me. Because they were aware of anti-Semitism, you know, because of what was going on in Germany during the war years, for sure, and leading up to the war years. Excuse me. So, and they would talk about it at home. I mean, so I was aware of of anti-Semitism, but not too much in my personal life. I didn't have problem with. I had some problems in high school with some of the kids, but not a lot.
You said earlier that your family moved moved to Milwaukee at the time that you were finishing high school, so you went to college and then came back. Where did you go to college? What did you study? And then when did you move back to Milwaukee?
I went to college in 1953. I went to the University of Wisconsin, and I was there my entire undergraduate time through 1957. And I majored in accounting. I got a business degree. And then from there I went on to the University of Michigan and got a law degree. That was from 1957 to 1960.
Did you know throughout that you were going to come back and go into the family business?
Well, I always sort of thought that might be an interesting thing to do, but so I felt that eventually I would. I really didn't believe that I would ever practice law as such for any length of time. It was one of those things. My parents, thank God for them, were strong believers in the importance of a good education, and there was no question about whether we would go on. My sister and I would go on to college. I mean, that was a given. There was no discussion or debate about that, and more importantly, my parents, but mainly my father, felt that, well, accounting and law was a very good background for any young man to have. In those days, male chauvinism was not unheard of, and so I'm not so sure that he concentrated quite so much on my sister as to what she should do. And I think he was ambivalent about whether she really needed to go to college or not. Fortunately, I think my mother won that argument and she went, and I think she would agree with that assessment. But his feeling was that accounting and law would be a very good background to have. His sense was that no matter what happened, and I think he had the notions of the impacts of anti-Semitism on his mind. No matter what happened, I could always be an accountant, or I could always be a lawyer, and nobody could ever take that away from me. And I would be able to survive. Whereas in corporate America at the time, it was difficult at times for Jews to get jobs.
When you moved back then to Milwaukee after finishing your undergraduate and graduate degrees, and you did move into family business, for most people it's interesting that the Marcus name, and for you, Steve, think of you as synonymous with Milwaukee because you're really part of the fabric and the culture of this community, and yet you didn't come back here until your mid-20s and established your home and your business life here, and you very quickly became part of the communal life of Milwaukee, the general, as you're well known today, and the Jewish community. What got you started in community life here in Milwaukee?
Well, I think we have to break that in two parts. I got started in Jewish community life just as I came out of college, basically. I was not very long when I started becoming involved in Federation campaigns, that sort of thing. And that was fairly easy because my father had been involved, the whole family, and my mother as well, had been involved in Ripon, and they were well known, again, because we had been in the movie theater business. My father had to come to Milwaukee periodically, even when we were in Ripon, because this is where he bought all the movies. And so in the course of doing that, he made a lot of friends here and knew a lot of the Jewish people. And of course, when he was looking to buy a house here, the word, the grapevine works very quickly in our community. And so the Jewish community leaders here knew that they were planning to come. I think he made contact with them. I think it was sort of a two-way thing. They were looking for him, but he was looking for them. And they had always had a history of involvement. They had always had a history of giving back, participating in community affairs. And so he was willing to be had, and they were looking for him. And so we quickly became integrated into the Jewish community here. And so it was an easy thing for me to start participating in. And so I did. And then, of course, becoming involved in the broader community probably was facilitated by virtue of the fact that shortly after I returned, we became involved with the Pfister Hotel. And at that time, downtown Milwaukee only had one real, what you would call a premier hotel. In those days, that was the Schrader Hotel. The Pfister had been at one time, but it had fallen in disrepair and was sort of a non-entity as a hotel factor at that time. But my father's feeling was that the Schrader was on the way down, and that if somebody did the right thing with the Pfister, that it could become the premier hotel in the community. And that whoever owned the premier hotel in the community took on some level of importance in the community. And so we acquired the Pfister, we renovated it, we put an addition on it, and lo and behold, we were beginning to be the site of conventions, and important meetings, and lots of community social affairs, because for the first time the community had a wonderful ballroom. And of course, in doing that, the people who were involved with the hotel had to become involved with their customers. And so we would buy tables for the Symphony Ball and for the, I think Ball-the-Lac was there one year, and many, many important social affairs, weddings that would occur there. So we were very front and center. And in that role, you can be as front and center as you like, but if you value your customers, and if you want to help solidify your business, you participate in those things, and that was what we did. So it wasn't hard.
Continue along that thread. What types of activities did you initially, and to this day, focus your attention on in the broader general community? What organizations, what causes have you found to be most closest to your heart, or in ways that you thought were most important for you to be involved in?
Well, I think the things that we found the most important in terms of the broader community related to the fact that we were in the movie theater business, because we were growing our circuit of theaters all the way along, which in a way is a type of visual or performing arts type of thing. And so we became involved in the kinds of activities that we thought would not only enhance that, but also enhance the community at the same time. And so probably our first major involvement was with the Symphony. The Symphony, as we know it today, really didn't exist back then. It was just becoming formative. There was no Performing Arts Center, which is now called the Marcus Center, but in those days that didn't exist. And so what might have been known as our symphony orchestra played in the old auditorium, which was not a very good venue for it. And that was really the first involvement that we had with that sort of thing. And from there, we became supportive of all kinds of various and sundry performing arts types of venues, including the sponsorship of, heavy sponsorship and involvement with Summerfest. And from there, that led to our donation for the Marcus Amphitheater and the involvement with that. And in fact, during that time period, I, during 1 year, chaired the Summerfest, which was just in its formative years at that time. That was, I think, I chaired like the 7th one or something like that. And it, of course, it went on, and as you know, to become very, very successful and a huge tourism draw, a huge cultural event in the community. And it also then spawned all of the other summer festivals, because they're all held at the Summerfest grounds. But Summerfest was one of only a handful that were financially successful, and it then subsidized all the other festivals into existence. And so that, and so we've been involved in virtually all of those performing arts types of activities, to the point where then subsequently I chaired the United Performing Arts Fund campaign during one year, and have been involved in working for it for a long time, many years.
In addition, or outside of the arts and culture, and I understand, and our listeners and readers and viewers will as well, some of the rationale for that, are there other particular causes in the general community that have been close to your heart, or things that you've felt personally that you wanted to support and or get involved in?
Well, I think I spend most of, if I had to sort of break it down in terms of where the time involvement is, and perhaps even financial involvement, probably the performing arts is still the place where we do most of what we do. But I went on after that, and because our concern, because we have employees who are spread throughout the community, I felt it important to support the kinds of things that are helpful to them beyond the performing arts. And so I became involved with United Way and chaired that campaign a few years back, simply because it provides so many services to the broader community. And so that was a very important aspect. Recently, we became involved with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and providing funds for what will be known as the Marcus Prize in Architecture. So because I think I've had a feeling that we need to improve the physical beauty of the community, and that we might be able to do something in terms of better architecture to get better looking buildings built here. And so that's perhaps a little diversion from where we've been, but still in all relates to quality of life here in the community. And that relates to the fact that our family is here. I've raised my kids here, and so now this is third generation of Marcuses in the Milwaukee area. And maybe there'll be another generation after that, who knows. But anything we can do to enhance the quality of life, it's nice to be able to contribute to that.
You mentioned your involvement with United Way as the chair of their campaign, and I know we'll talk in a moment about your leadership in the Jewish community and the breadth of that involvement. And earlier on you stated that, when your family moved here, they were quickly known and wanted to be known, and it was natural for you to get involved in Federation activity when you got back, and Federation is similar to United Way in many respects. Well, what types of involvement have you had in the Jewish community in the Federation, and in addition to the Federation, that you'd care to share?
Well, I think that's very interesting. During the early years of our being here, my father was very involved in the Jewish community, and I was raising a young family, so he was more involved even than I was. He ultimately chaired the Federation campaign for, I think it was a couple of years. Back, it would have been probably in the mid-'60s. I'm pretty sure I have my timing right on that. And interestingly enough, my father-in-law also had chaired the Federation campaign even before my father did.
Your father-in-law, Marvin Glassbeagle.
Marvin Glassbeagle, yes. And so they were all very involved in raising money for important community needs, but also for Israel, because there was a lot going on in Israel at the time. I guess there always is, but it was just at the beginnings of major requirements for support to Israel. And so they were heavily involved, and I think as we sort of divided up the responsibilities, as my father became more involved in that, I sort of stayed home more and took care of the business side of things. And as I said, I was raising a young family, and so my time was somewhat limited. As time moved along, because of my involvement with our hotels, because I then became the person that was watching over our hotels, my father continued to watch over the movie theaters. my involvement really headed toward the broader community as opposed to the Jewish community, and that was where I spent a lot more of my time. It seemed as though that was a part of my designated territory, and I never forget my father. One day came in and he said, "Well, he said I'm going to luncheon at the Federation." I said, "Gee, I'm going too." He said, "You know, if you have something else that's more important, why don't you do that? We can be in two places at the same time that way." And so after that, we sort of divided it up along those lines. And not to say we didn't on many occasions go to something together, but often we would just say, well, let's take care of the two different things. And so I spent a lot of time. I always worked on the Federation campaign, but and I spent many years on the board of the Federation, but never as heavily involved because my father was heavily involved. And then it's been in recent years that I became involved with co-chaired Operation Exodus a number of years back, and of course now I'm involved with the Community Capital Campaign because part of the philosophy that my parents always had, it's something that they passed down, was that you need to first of all, you have to participate, but just as importantly, the notion of taking care of the next generation. And we've used up the facilities, and when I say used up, in quotes, that have been given to us by our parents, and we need to now replace them and refresh them and enhance them for the next generation.
I want to talk about that in a moment, but one other communal question for you. You mentioned at that important time in Israel's life, and the needs were great, and people were therefore stepping forward, doing things for Israel, and you alluded to some meetings that your father at the time attended and subsequently. What's your relationship to Israel? When was the first time you traveled to Israel, and what's your sense of Israel and Israel diaspora relations?
You know, I don't recall exactly when the timing of my first trip. It was when we were involved in the Federation campaigns and were becoming major givers to the community. And one year had to be late 60s, early 70s maybe. I went on a prime minister's mission to Israel. That was very exciting. That was a wonderful trip, and so I got a firsthand feeling for what was going on in Israel. There's the only way you can understand it is to be there, and then I think probably you're pretty insulated when you're there, so you don't quite have the feeling about what it's like to actually live there. You have to live there and be with it every day, I think, to really understand it. But you had a sense of certainly how small it was, what remarkable things that they've done there. And subsequently, I've been back on a number of occasions, not as many as I would have liked, but I have been back a number of different times, and one including a trip to Russia as a side, and then coming in from Russia to Israel with immigrants people who were migrating from Russia to Israel at a time when it was very difficult to get out of Russia. And so that was an exciting, very exciting trip.
You mentioned now your involvement in the community's capital campaign and refreshing and building for the future generations. As a chronicler of history, somebody who's been involved generationally in our life, of the Jewish community in Milwaukee for many years, what's your sense of the current ambiance of the Milwaukee Jewish community, and more importantly, Steve, the future of Jewish life here in town?
Well, I'm encouraged about the future of Jewish life here in town. I think we need to do, I think our Jewish population has been shrinking somewhat over the last, let's say, 20 years or so. Probably not enormously, but it's not growing, and it's probably aging a little bit. You might know the numbers better than I do, but I believe that's the case. And but I think Milwaukee as a whole is becoming a far more attractive place for young people to not only to grow up but to live. And perhaps it's possible that we'll start to see some in-migration here as years move along, because the same things that attract the broader population to Milwaukee, especially the population of young people, will attract young Jewish people to the community. Now we have to have a good Jewish community infrastructure in order to optimize on that. But I believe it's important that as our community provides the kinds of infrastructure and programs and cultural environments for young people to be attractive to young people, that the Jewish community needs to do the same, so it will become just as attractive to young Jewish people.
It's good to hear. Thinking about that and your impact and influence in that area, whether it be in your personal life, Steve, or in your professional career activities, or in your Jewish communal life, however you wish to define it, what accomplishments are you most proud of that you'd like to share with viewers of this video?
Well, I think that I'd like them to know that I think we've been an important contributor to the community, that we have made a difference in the Milwaukee community for all of its citizens, Jews and non-Jews alike. And but along with that, the fact that the people in the broader community know that we're Jewish. That we're Jewish and we've contributed to the whole community. I think all too often the sense is that that Jewish people tend to take care of the Jewish community, but they don't have an interest beyond that. And so I'm hopeful that people appreciate the fact that that we've made the statement that that's not true, that the Jewish community have the same needs and wants that of everybody else, and that we also participate in building the community.
So one of your sense of pride and accomplishment is to have straddled both worlds effectively and to help educate and interpret that to the general community that Jews can support both, and to the Jewish community that it's important to do that, and so you've taken care of your own and the broader community.
Yeah.
Conversely, are there any disappointments or regrets that you'd want to share in any facet of your personal or professional or community life, things that you had thought about doing but didn't do or get to, or disappointments?
Well, whatever I didn't get to, I'm still working on.
Good to hear.
No, I don't think so. I think we all have some things we wish we had done differently, or had been able, if we had more time to do more. And every time I think about that, I think about, yeah, but I needed to spend more time with my own kids, and so I've been very fortunate in that respect, and I have no, as I say, I have no regrets, other than if I had 36 hours in a day and I've had 8 days in a week, then I would have been able to do even more.
Well, in that regard, are there any lessons in life that you've learned that have helped carry you through, or do you have a personal philosophical statement that's the underpinning of how you operate?
Oh, gee. Well, I think probably we each have different philosophies about things that we do. In other words, I may have some guiding principles around my work. I have some guiding principles around my family. But I'd have to say that if I would look for an overarching thing, it's the importance of giving back to your community. It's a lot of fun to be able to do it. Not everybody is privileged to be able to do it. Not everybody has the wherewithal and perhaps the family support system that you need. A lot of the things, I take them for granted. I've sort of, I hate to use the phrase fallen into them. I don't think I fell into them. I participated in making whatever it is that's here. But just the fact that I'm able to participate in community affairs, I've got a great deal of pleasure out of that. And I think if other people knew how good it feels, they would improve their own participation as well.
Well, in that regard, stretching from philosophy of life and practice, without imposing too much personally upon you, is there Is there some statement you'd like to make about how you'd like to be remembered to those who watch this video and to future generations?
Well, I think I'd like to be remembered as somebody who made a difference and who had some good fortune and was willing to share it.
Just kind of sidebarring, and more out of curiosity, and for interest's sake, you have family here and many friends and extended friends, and you're very your family's been considered to be very close knit. So people would think they know about you directly or indirectly. Is there something about you, either an interest that you might have, or a particular talent, or just something that most friends and family wouldn't know but might find interesting to hear?
Well, I guess I'd have to say that I've been around for almost 70 years now, and if I haven't divulged it yet, I'm not going to. No, I don't think so. I'm a pretty open person, and I think people know me reasonably well. Perhaps the one thing that they might not expect is that I think basically I'm very shy. I don't know how I'm perceived in that respect, but I'm a pretty shy person.
Well, that might be unusual for people to sense that about you, given how public you are.
Yeah, I'm very public, and I do a lot of, I make a fair number of public type presentations, and as the CEO of a public company, I'm in pretty good view all the time, but never without considerable trepidation about it. And as I say, I feel very shy. I think about, I'll walk into a restaurant, for example, and I may know a lot of people at various tables in the restaurant, and I'll rarely stop and talk to any of them at their tables. Now that's because I just feel a shyness about doing it. I'm uneasy with it. I don't feel comfortable interrupting people while they're having their dinner. I don't know if you would call that shyness, but I find it difficult to sort of cut into a conversation or cut into somebody's eating exercise, whatever it is they're doing. So maybe that's something that people don't know. A little different from the public persona.
One more angle to that question, and then we'll wrap up. Is there anything in your life, personally or otherwise, that you have a tremendous passion for? I mean, you're multifaceted, you're all over the place in the best sense of the word, the things you do and your interests, but what you've shared with us. Is there something that you're just really very passionate about and try to stick with whenever you can?
Well, yeah, you're right. I probably have too many on my plate. I think there are a couple of things. One, as it relates to the Jewish community, and that's the importance of a strong Jewish community. My late wife once said, about being Jewish, and she was thinking about people who seem to not want to be Jewish or appear Jewish. Her question was, well, where do you go to resign? You're always a Jew. That's what we are. And so it's very important that the Jewish community be strong and be mutually supportive. And I do feel passionate about that. And if I had a priority, if I didn't have resources that we were able to put in a variety of places, this would be where they would go. And as a matter of fact, my personal, as opposed to my corporate resources, are mainly devoted to the Jewish community, overwhelmingly so. The other thing that I think is very important, and this relates to the broader community, has been the idea of the importance that arts and culture play in our lives. The old saying, man does not live by bread alone, I think is very true. And our community is strengthened enormously by the fact that we've got a great symphony and a great ballet and a great opera and a great repertory theater and all manner of other performing arts, a great art museum, I mean, a world-class art museum, if the others are not, which I arguably they also are approaching that level. But our art museum is particularly special. And I mean, I just feel those are extremely important because they make a big difference in the quality of life for people of all religions and all races in the Milwaukee area.
Thank you. Steve, is there anything that you'd like to talk about or touch upon that we didn't get to during this session?
I think you covered the waterfront very well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.